Hi, everyone. Welcome to Swasti Cafe or Conversations Cafe at Swasti. Today, I have with me Radhika, and Radhika Chabria has been an entrepreneur. She still is an entrepreneur. She is somebody who works widely with sexual reproductive health and rights. She has been working very, very deeply in the space of adolescent and children's access to not only health but also education and just holistic well-being, putting it as a whole in a nutshell. And she has also very lately been spearheading Swasti's telecare initiative called HelloSwasti. So thank you, Radhika. Thank you so much for joining me today. It is such a joy to see you here. So let's just hear from you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Shri. You're always so generous with your introductions. It's truly an honor to be here today. And I've been associated with Swasti for quite a while now and true admirer of their work. And in that spirit, joined hands to sort of multiply impact. So, yes, I am still a social entrepreneur. I'm still with Swasti and I still hold all my passions very close to me.
That's so good to hear that, yeah, Radhika. And I'm so glad you could make it here. I know that things are really, really busy for you. So I'm not going to take too much of your time, but there are a bunch of things that I want to talk to you about. But before that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey so far?
Sure. So, I mean, I started off as a Teach for India fellow in the development sector. I spent 2 years teaching 82 little brats in a slum in Jogeshwari, Bombay. And it was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. I have truly never experienced anything that gave me more joy. Following which, I went into a couple of other nonprofits, went into sort of mentorship, and then I went to study at the London School of Economics. I went to pursue a master's in social innovation and entrepreneurship, which again was a really great eye opener for me as to the potential for impact and the potential for growth within the social sector itself. That brought me back to India, and I sort of was looking around for inspiration, and that's where inspiration struck with menstrual cups. It was something that I had used myself for a while, and I found potential for it within the development space as well. And so the model basically works with women from low income communities through training as well as micro enterprise. And over the through that process, I also met Swasti, got involved very closely with the work that Swasti did with schools, with the community, and that sort of brought me here with Swasti as a social innovation and entrepreneurship catalyst, whatever that means. But yeah, I'm really glad to be sort of spearheading the telecare initiatives. It's been an incredible learning experience, and wouldn't have it any other way.
That's lovely to know. And Radhika, I know that today we said that we're going to talk about telecare because I'm so gung ho and excited about it. But why don't you tell us a little bit about Shakti as well, the entire menstrual cup piece that you have been working on. You have been working very closely on micro entrepreneurship, even to kind of look at livelihood alternatives for women who are from the urban poor communities as well as the rural poor communities with us in the Invest for Wellness program. So tell us a little bit about that, and then we're going to jump right into telecare.
Sure thing. So for me, what really irked me about the problem with menstrual cups was that someone actually said, but they can't use it. And I'm the kind of person where if you throw a challenge at me, I will say challenge accepted and I'll find a way to fix that problem. So that was where it actually started. And when I got started, it was really surprising for me because, in a lot of ways, maybe I didn't believe it myself, but the women who actually started using the cups gave me this inspiration that it was actually possible for a woman from a low income community to actually make this switch. So some of my favorite stories actually come from the collaboration we have with Swasti as well, and it's no coincidence that it's Shakti and Swasti, and I constantly mess it up. But women like Julie, women like Priyanka from the community who are so passionate about it themselves, they've taken this and run with it, and they sort of talk about these products with their community members. They encourage them to take it up. They give them hope that it is possible to do it. And when they come back to me with stories like, I gave 30 cups to my sort of bhabhi in the village, and my bhabhi's making sales of those cups now. And it's amazing to see because they've found a supply chain themselves with nothing that I had to do. So honestly, it's a very light touch model, and that's what I love about it, because it's owned by the women who actually do it.
And more power to you. And for those of us who are listening to this, or watching us today in this conversation, if you want to learn a little more about what Radhika's work has all been about, she has recently written this phenomenal write-up, a blog actually. It's called Catalyzing a Cup Rising, and you're going to find it on different platforms, but I think an easy way of looking it up would be in the Swasti site itself. We have hosted the article there, and it's also there in other places on the web. So do check it out. And if you are interested in knowing more about Shakti, then please, please, please do link back to Radhika at some point. Radhika, tell me about TeleCare. Tell me about how it all started, and tell me a little bit about the journey that you've had with TeleCare, right? From the time that I think you kind of like were co-conceptualizing it with the team that we have at Swasti, the health team in particular, as well as the program teams. And I remember you pushing the accelerator on it when the first wave for COVID-19 hit. And I know those were difficult times, continues to be difficult times, but tell us a little bit about how the concept started. And I know that I kind of like stepped in a little later after the concept kind of like matured a little to kind of like do the entire naming and the branding ceremonies. But other than that, there's so much that I've missed on this journey. So love to hear from you. Go for it.
Sure, Shri. So when the first wave of COVID hit back in March 2020, we very quickly realized that COVID was a real concern. However, it wasn't the primary concern. The lack of access to primary healthcare was actually of more concern to us, because we knew that there were people within the community with chronic health conditions. These people needed access to healthcare, but with the really, really strict lockdown that we went under, it was impossible for them to access this healthcare. Secondly, there was a lot of fear, which entailed that we actually had to put in place people who might be able to address these fears that the community was having. And thirdly, as a result of lockdown, obviously, what was perceived then to be an invisible problem, but actually should have been very apparent, was that there would be economic impacts on the livelihoods of people. They lost livelihood, they didn't have savings, and therefore, they hunger and the lack of access to money became a bigger problem. So that was the core of what we said telecare would be. Telecare was a solution that would address not just health, but also would provide counseling as well as social protection. So those were the three pillars of telecare at that point in time. And at the core of this very model lay our wellness facilitators who were on the ground, actually communicating with people and telling them that this service actually existed. Telecare had, it ran its course, it had its peaks, it had its troughs, but where we are right now, and what's really changed between Telecare O1 to Telecare O2, so as to say, is that at that point when we went ahead with Telecare O1, we had to make people aware of COVID. We had to build the awareness around it, and we had to sort of screen people who might have been at risk of serious COVID. However, now the difference is everything is assumed to be COVID. The spread of COVID is so vast and so widespread that every single symptom is assumed to be COVID. So the focus of telecare has now changed to COVID itself, as well as providing counseling to people who have been affected by COVID and social protection for people who have been affected by COVID. So COVID now has become the core of telecare, so as to say. However, our wellness facilitators are still the crux of the program. They're still the ones who conduct community surveillance, and that's the starting point of establishing contact with the community. Something we realized very early on with telecare was that expecting a community member to pick up the phone and make a call inward to a helpline was very ambitious, was very utopian, and probably wouldn't happen. We had to find a way to reach the community where they were at, and that's where community health workers come into the fore. That is where they really make connect with the community in order to in order to help us reach them as well. So that was the journey of telecare, and it's been quite an interesting journey because there's been so much of learning along the way. We the concept of accessing medicine over the telephone didn't exist before 2020. So it's really been a huge shift in mindset that has to happen, and we're seeing that take place this year.
Wow, the fact that you started this work with communities, and I'm going to take off from where you left off right this moment, right, where you said that the concept of reaching out to the medical fraternity, accessing medicines, accessing healthcare over the phone, as a concept did not exist before 2020, especially with the most marginalized. And telecare, the way that you guys designed it, the way that whatever the entire work that was around it was for the most poor and marginalized communities in India. We are talking about women in sex work. We are talking about men who have sex with men, marginalized gay men. We are talking about transgender people. We are talking about women in factories. We are talking about garment workers, again, women in factories and people in factories. We're talking about the urban poor. We're talking about rural poor. And we are talking about adolescents and young people as well. And then for them to access something like this, where they don't even require a smartphone, and at the same time know that there is somebody who really cares about them on the other side of the line, and somebody who they know, it's a wellness facilitator, it's a community health worker, or from a word of mouth, they know that, hey, my relative lives here and they have a community health worker, and I've met her when I have gone to their place. And like that entire, it's a community of trust that was created. And do you think that it is the feeling of trust, the feeling of faith, the social capital that was built already with the communities knowing that they're at the center of the program, that really helped telecare bridge that gap which was created by COVID and the early response to COVID?
Absolutely, Shri. I don't think telecare could have existed had it not been for that social capital. Because India is not for lack of helplines, right? There are numerous helplines out there. But why is it that people still want to talk to this particular nurse or this particular facilitator who they are aware of? It's primarily because they hold social capital. And social capital is such a wonderful thing because, it's so hyper localized that it allows us to respond in that way as well. So if we know, for instance, there is someone in distress in this particular community, we're able to reach out to them through their own networks and through people who they trust. So absolutely, telecare would not have existed had it not been for the social capital.
Right. And I think there's a lot of faith as well, right? That if I call this number, I will get the help and the care that I need. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the kind of services that telecare offers to a
Sure,
caller?
sure. Telecare is again based on the same three pillars that I said. Telecare 101.0 is based on. Uh, Telecare is based on three primary things. The first is access to a nurse who will then be able to bridge the gap between someone who may not necessarily have access to a doctor, may not necessarily understand what a doctor is saying. So the nurse acts as that bridging point. The second pillar of telecare is actually access to mental health support. So we have counselors on the back end who can actually provide mental health support. And thirdly is access to social protection. We understand that there are numerous government entitlements for communities that they can't necessarily access because of the lack of awareness or the lack of the skill to actually uh, fill in the form or go to the government website and avail of that scheme. And that's where we come in. We know what kind of things people from certain communities might require, and that's what we're trying to bridge. So those are the three primary services that we offer as part of telecare.
Right. And I think the other thing is the way that it plugs in, right? I like recently there was like the story which came to me from I think it was Indore, and it was from the telecare team at Indore, where they were talking about a family who had called them in distress, saying that there's a one of her family members is really, really unwell. And the nurse, through her interaction, realized that the person needed oxygen immediately and contacted the field team. And the field team went physically to this person's house and just made sure that the person was taken to the nearest hospital, received oxygen therapy, and is now doing pretty well. I mean, is recovering well. So fingers crossed on that. But I think the fact that it doesn't just end at a phone call, that there is a tangible call to action which is met. I think that has been the crux of the well-being service overall that has worked. And I think it has also built further the social capital, the trust, the faith that if I call this number, there is going to be help availed and help at hand. Is this something that was, and I know that it was part of the design framework, it was an intentional design, so to speak, right? But what triggered this? What triggered you to come up with this idea that this has to be an intentional design where there is the loop starts and the loop closes? How did that come about?
Um, so when we think of telecare and how telecare might differ from telemedicine is a one-time interaction that a patient will have with a doctor, most likely, who will assess the patient and in a matter of 10 minutes provide a diagnosis and prescription, and that is the end of that interaction. However, through our experience on the ground as well, working with communities, we learned that often the problem is so complex that it requires additional touch points with the community. It requires frequent touch points with the community. And that's where actually the difference lies in what we're doing in telecare and what telemedicine is. When a nurse registers a patient on the platform, she is actually going to be following up with that patient through the entire 14 days of recovery and after that if necessary. So it's a continuum of care, it's comprehensive. But most importantly, what makes this very, very different from anything else that exists out there is the fact that it's team led. Every person who's part of this team is going to be talking to someone else. The wellness facilitator's information feeds in to the nurse's information. The nurse's information feeds into the doctor's information. Further, this information might feed into the social protection scheme. This information might feed into the counselors. It might feed into the emergency response teams. So it's really a team effort. The nurse cannot do her job if the wellness facilitator doesn't. And if the nurse doesn't do her job, the emergency response team can't. So, it's very interconnected. It's nurse centric. However, it is comprehensive and it is continuous. So those were some of the very intentional elements we designed into this because we knew that communities would benefit from it and there was really no one else doing it for them. So we had to step up and be those touch points for them through their entire journey with COVID because it's not easy. It isn't easy for any of us who contract COVID. And we talked about an example where someone had to actually get oxygen, and those are some cases that we see. But it was really heartening for me to actually hear from one of our internal employees who we also deployed telecare for. Who actually reached out to us and said that it wasn't about the quality of care so as to say that she really valued. She just valued someone reaching out to her and talking to her every single day. That was her comfort, and that is what people value. They don't really have someone to talk to, and that's what we're providing them.
Right. Along with everything else and the care and
Along
making
with
sure.
everything else.
Yeah, so making sure that it's nurturing as well as an anchoring presence that really helps in recovery. And that is so important. And that's what even recent studies around well-being have been saying, right? And this actually brings me to this point where I remember that I came into your team to kind of like where we were trying to brainstorm a name for the telecare service. And we said that we wanted a name that the community is familiar with and the community loves already. And I remember this actually came from the community saying that why can't we call it Swasti? And then we were like, okay, we'll call it HelloSwasti because it's like hello Swasti. But more importantly, because Swasti means well-being, right? And when we talk about telecare, it's about making everyday well-being a reality. So not just COVID, but even looking at comorbidities, which make people more vulnerable to COVID, or make recovery difficult. So how do you prevent it? By making sure that they have the right information at the right time, as well as in case there is an infection, how do you look at recovery, which is better, as well as making sure that the symptoms remain in mild to moderate as much as possible. Now, in this entire continuum of care, in this entire bringing well-being to the doorstep, becoming a partner to well-being, and all of this entire idea of hello Swasti, can you tell me a little bit about how do you see the primary healthcare landscape changing, or rather evolving with telecare coming in for the most poor and vulnerable?
Mhm. That's a really interesting question, Shri, because, while the eye on the ball is currently on COVID, we're actually looking at COVID being an entry point into communities becoming more and more comfortable in accessing telecare. We know, for instance, diabetes is a severe pandemic within our country. We know that hypertension is so common within these communities. We know for a fact. However, adherence to medicines, adherence to lifestyle changes are harder to track, and that's where telecare becomes a really really interesting add-on, because through telecare we can actually reach far more with fewer resources. And that's where we're really looking to take telecare in the future. We want it to become something that people will receive, for instance, a monthly call to check in with them on what their sugar levels have been. We will we look at it as being a mechanism to actually reach them every single touch point through the telephone, versus just an in-person interaction that is often hard to do and less frequent. So we can do more frequency, we can do it more effectively, and we can actually track changes using technology. So that's what's really exciting. And I think the entire primary healthcare landscape in the country is slowly shifting in that direction. I can't tell you how many calls we're on where, everyone's trying to get into telehealth and telecare. And I couldn't welcome that anymore, because I see that as the future, and it's low cost, it's accessible, it's easy for people to use, it's trustworthy. And, if we're able to really build all these sort of different components into it, we really have something that can accelerate primary healthcare in our country.
Thank you so much for that, Radhika. I think more power to you and more power to your tribe. May your tribe only grow, 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 and may the collaborations just become that space where we ultimately are in that space where we leave no one behind, and we make primary healthcare so accessible and so doable, right? I mean, I still remember in my early days in the public health space, I remember speaking to girls and women, young girls and women, who said that, who felt that anemia was something that they had to live with,
Mhm.
because treating anemia was difficult, it was very complicated, and it was very cost intensive, and where cost is not just money but also time and the effort and everything else, given the situations that we find ourselves in often. And I think something like telecare, something like making sure primary healthcare is accessible, affordable, and doable, is becomes very very important. So more power to you guys and more power to your tribe. And I think we will close this here, but is there something that you want to tell the world about telecare and accessing telecare and taking it to the last mile?
I think if I just have to close off on this, I think I'd like to just end by saying that we're in a really, really exciting space when it comes to digital health. And the more we can take healthcare to the doorstep of our communities, the more likely we are for them to have improved well being. And if we're able to do that with different partners across the private sector, across the government sector, internationally, I think there would be nothing more exciting than that, because uh, the more we learn from each other and the more we incorporate what the others are doing, at the end of the day, keeping communities at the center, they're the ones who are going to benefit. So I'm really excited because I know we're working with some fabulous partners on this, and I really can't wait to see how this scales.
Thank you so much for this, Radhika. This was a lovely conversation to have. And once again, more power to you and your tribe and every collaborator that you can find on this journey. I also know that TeleCare is taking up different avatars, and we are going to talk about that a little more in other segments that we do with you. And here's to bringing it in the hands of the people. Here is to making democratizing health and well-being for the most poor and marginalized. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us at this segment of Swasti Cafe and the Conversations Cafe at Swasti. And I'm going to see you for more later on. That's Radhika Chabria. Do follow her work. Check out everything that she's working on. We will leave her credentials at the description so that you can follow her and her work for the rest of the time. Thank you so much. This is your host,
Thank you.
Shrirupa and Radhika signing off. Thank you so much, Radhika.